My name is Ray. I am 57 years old and I've had enough time to understand who I am, what I've become, and why things happened the way they did. Life has a way of shaping you, and if you're lucky, you can look back and understand the contours of your past. For me, the understanding came slowly, methodically, like a soldier learning the exact pressure to apply when polishing his boots. But it wasn't always clear, especially when I was younger. I grew up in a small town, a place where everyone knew everyone, and everyone's business was fodder for the next Sunday sermon. My parents were strict, almost cold in their ways, and they had high expectations for both me and my younger brother Jeremy. But for them, expectations were something to be met with perfection. For me, well, I was never perfect enough. I remember my childhood as a series of small, unnoticed battles. My parents, mostly my mother, never spared a chance to tell me that I wasn't living up to their standards. My temper, they called it. My aggressive nature, they said. It wasn't that I was a violent child. No, I wasn't punching kids in the schoolyard or breaking things for no reason. It was simply that I was too much for them. Too loud, too intense, too unwilling to fit into their neat little box of what a child should be. I think it started when I was about 8. I can still see my mother's face, the way her eyes narrowed when I did something that didn't fit the image they wanted me to project. I could feel the disapproval in the air, thick like humidity before a storm. But it wasn't the first time. It was just the culmination of years of feeling like I didn't belong in their world. A world that was more about maintaining an image of perfection than about being real, being human. Jeremy, on the other hand, was everything I wasn't. Quiet, obedient, docile. He was everything my parents could be proud of without effort. He was the one who did everything right. The one who never questioned. The one who never rocked the boat. He was their perfect son, and I wasn't. When I was 10, they made the decision that would change everything. They sent me away to a private military school in another state. It wasn't exactly a punishment, or so they said. No, they claimed I needed structure, discipline, a place to focus my energy. They said I needed to learn control, to be more like Jeremy. But deep down, I knew it wasn't about any of that. I had become a nuisance to them, a constant reminder that they weren't perfect, and that was something they couldn't bear. I wasn't given a choice. There was no discussion. One day after another argument, they simply told me I was going. The bags were packed, the papers were signed, and just like that, I was no longer part of their lives, at least not in the way I used to be. The school was far away, across state lines, a whole world apart. They sent me to that school without ceremony, without even a proper goodbye. I remember being in the back seat of the car, looking out of the window, and seeing the town shrink smaller and smaller in the distance. The silence in the car was deafening, and I could feel my mother's eyes boring into the back of my head, as if she was trying to convince herself that she had made the right decision. But it wasn't right. I knew it then. It wasn't about discipline. It was about getting rid of me. The military school wasn't a typical boarding school. No, this was a place where they trained boys to become soldiers. There were rules, rigid ones, and punishments for every infraction. The days were long, the work grueling. The only thing you could count on was structure, and even that wasn't always reliable. There were no phone calls home, no letters, no visits. It was like I had fallen off the map. It was as if I ceased to exist for them. They didn't need me anymore. I spent my teenage years there, a place where I learned the value of silence, of obedience, and of controlling the storms within me. They broke me down in ways I didn't fully understand at the time, and built me back up again, a man who could withstand anything. The military school wasn't just about learning to march in line or follow orders. It was about endurance, about surviving the grueling monotony and harshness, about becoming something different from the boy I used to be, something harder, something colder, something that didn't need anyone else to survive. I learned self-discipline, something my parents had never been able to teach me. I learned that pain could be controlled, that weakness was a choice, and that if you could master your mind, you could overcome anything. But what they failed to realize, what they couldn't see, is that they weren't just sending me away to be fixed. They were giving me the tools I would need to one day come back and take everything they had kept from me. They didn't realize that in sending me away, they were turning me into something I hadn't been before. Something stronger, something smarter, something capable of taking everything from them. Not with anger, not with violence, but with precision, with control. I spent years learning to become a machine, a cold, calculating machine, one that could endure, adapt, and overcome. The world I lived in was one of constant challenge, but there was one thing I learned there more than anything else: to never make a sound, to never show weakness, to never let anyone see the cracks. And I didn't. Not until I was ready. But the real lesson, the one I learned in silence, was patience. That they never taught me, but I figured it out on my own. It wasn't until I was well into adulthood that the truth hit me, like an old, forgotten secret that I had never even realized I was keeping. My childhood, my time at that school, everything that had led to my transformation, it all started to make sense. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't a revelation that came in a single moment. It was more like peeling the layers off an onion, one at a time, until I could finally see the core of it all. The truth was that my parents hadn't sent me to military school because I was too aggressive or difficult to control. Those were just convenient excuses they could sell themselves, and by extension, anyone else who asked. I wasn't sent there to be fixed either. No, the real reason they sent me away was far more pragmatic, far colder. It happened by chance. One day as I was going through some old papers, I stumbled upon something I wasn't supposed to see. It was a letter, a note tucked away in a box filled with old family documents. A letter from the law firm that had handled my grandfather's estate. My mind drifted to memories of him, my grandfather, the only man in my family who ever showed any interest in me. I remembered how he would slip me a few dollars when my parents weren't looking, how he'd tell me I was smart, capable, worthy when no one else did. But the letter wasn't about him. It was about what he left behind. My grandfather had been a wealthy man, though it was something none of us really discussed openly. His money, his property, it was a subject of quiet whispers at family gatherings. After his death, I had assumed the estate would be divided equally between my parents and their two children. But the letter painted a different picture. My brother, Jeremy, was the sole beneficiary of everything. All of it. The house, the money, the land, everything. And then I remembered how my parents had always seemed so eager to get rid of me, how they'd spoken of my temper and my inability to fit in. But there was nothing about that in the letter, nothing about my behavior, nothing about the excuse they'd fed me for years. It was a well-organized lie, crafted to keep me out of the way. I spent a long time reading and rereading that letter. I could feel the blood drain from my face as the weight of it settled in. My parents had sent me away, not because I was difficult, but because they didn't want to share my grandfather's inheritance. They didn't want a reminder of their own imperfections, their own failings. They wanted to protect their prize, Jeremy, the golden child, the one who would inherit it all. They had seen me as an obstacle, someone who might challenge their authority, who might disrupt the comfortable, controlled life they'd built. So they erased me, not physically, but emotionally. They sent me away to a place where I would be broken down and rebuilt, a place where they could forget about me, where they could pretend I never existed, where they could pretend I wasn't part of their lives anymore. For years, I had lived under the belief that I was sent to military school because of some inherent flaw in me. I thought I was just too difficult for them to handle. But the truth was far more insidious. It was about money. It was about control. It was about keeping their lives free from any disruption, even if that meant casting me aside. And that's when I realized just how much I had been betrayed. Not just by my parents, but by the very world I had tried so hard to belong to. My whole life had been a carefully constructed illusion, one that had been built on lies. They had thrown me away to protect their own interests, and I had been blind to it until now. But that was the thing with truth. It always finds its way out. It doesn't care how long it takes or how carefully you hide it. The truth doesn't just sit in the shadows forever. It finds its way into the light, And when it does, it has a way of changing everything. At that moment, something shifted in me. The anger wasn't what hit me first, though. No. What I felt more than anything else was clarity, a cold, calculated understanding of just how far they were willing to go to protect their own interests. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but it was also the moment I decided that I would take everything from them, everything they had kept from me. But it wouldn't be out of rage. No, that would have been a mistake. Rage was something I could no longer afford. No, I would take everything with precision, with patience. The same patience I had learned over the years. They had underestimated me for too long, and now it was my turn to show them exactly what they had created. By the time I was discharged from the military, I had become a different person. A person who no longer reacted out of emotion, but instead operated solely on discipline and calculation. It wasn't just about strength, though I had plenty of that. It was about the kind of steel that didn't bend, didn't break, and didn't make a sound. Military school had taught me the art of control, control over my emotions, control over my body, and most importantly, control over my mind. When I left, I didn't return to my parents or my brother. I didn't seek anyone out. I had learned that the key to survival was invisibility. The fewer people who knew you, the fewer people who could hurt you. So I reinvented myself. I became a ghost, one who moved quietly through the world unnoticed. I didn't need a last name. I didn't need connections. What I needed was a clean slate, and that's exactly what I built for myself. I took jobs at first, menial ones, things that paid enough to keep me afloat but didn't draw attention. I knew my worth, though. It wasn't in the work I did. It was in the way I saw the world. I wasn't like the others. I knew how to observe, how to analyze, how to take advantage of the small openings most people never even saw. I learned the art of blending in, of staying beneath the radar. And it worked. Eventually, I moved into business. I didn't take the direct route. No, I made my way in quietly. I studied companies that had potential, businesses that were underperforming, and I infiltrated them slowly. No one knew my name. No one knew my past. It was like I had been born again. And as I rose through the ranks, I did it with patience. I made connections, but always with a purpose. Nothing was ever too fast. Nothing ever too obvious. I built my own empire, one brick at a time. No one knew I was there, but I was always watching. And I wasn't just watching the businesses. I was watching the people in them. I understood them better than they understood themselves. I saw their weaknesses, their desires, their motivations. In the beginning, I wasn't looking for anything more than stability, but after a while I began to see something else. I started to see how much power there was in control, how much power there was in being the one who pulled the strings without anyone ever knowing it. It was a subtle form of domination, but it was domination nonetheless. I wasn't in it for the money, not at first. That came later, after I had built everything and understood how the game was played. Money became the tool I used to gain more influence, to control more people, to bend the rules of the world to my will. By the time I was ready, I was no longer just a participant. I was a player. I knew what I was doing, and I knew how to do it. The lessons from military school had been invaluable. Control, patience, observation. I used those lessons every day. But I also had something else, the power of memory, the power to remember who had hurt me, who had cast me aside, and why. I didn't let go of anything. I kept it all, locked away in the back of my mind, like a stored weapon waiting for the right time. And then one day the right time came. 40 years passed, and I never thought I'd cross paths with my brother again. Life had unfolded in ways I couldn't have anticipated, but I had made peace with the fact that he had what was mine. My inheritance, my place in the family, was a distant memory, something I had long buried. In truth, I had moved on. My focus had always been on building my life, my empire. Then one rainy afternoon, I ran into him. It wasn't a grand reunion. There were no warm embraces, no emotional speeches. No, it happened by chance, in a crowded downtown cafe where the fog of years seemed to close in on us both. I was sitting at the bar, sipping my coffee, my face half turned to the window, watching the streetlights flicker against the rain. It wasn't until I heard that familiar voice, a voice I hadn't heard in decades, that I turned. Ray? I froze. It was him. Older, of course, but unmistakable. I didn't react right away. I simply raised an eyebrow, letting the moment linger in the silence. He stepped closer, then stopped, his eyes narrowing in that familiar, calculating way. He seemed uncertain, but then recognition hit him. Oh, shit. Ray, is that really you? I didn't respond at first. I studied him carefully. There was something hollow about his demeanor, something strained in his smile. The years had not been kind to him, but then again, I wasn't here for any of that. I had a purpose. Well, seems like time hasn't been easy on you either, I said, my voice even, but with just the slightest edge. He laughed awkwardly, brushing a hand through his graying hair. Yeah. Well, you know how it goes. Life's been a real roller coaster. But hey, what's the deal? What brings you back? I could see the nervousness behind his casual tone, the way his eyes flicked around the room, unsure of whether he should sit down or leave. I took a sip of my coffee, letting the silence stretch for a moment longer before I spoke again. You're still in business, I see, I said, keeping my voice neutral. I knew the answer. He wouldn't have been here otherwise. He had always been drawn to the lure of money and status, but something was off. He wasn't the confident businessman I'd expected. He nodded, the smile coming back to his face. Yeah, it's been tough. Our company's on the edge. You wouldn't believe it. Cash flow problems, investors pulling out. We need someone to help us out, someone who can give us a real shot in the arm. His eyes met mine, holding my gaze for a beat longer than necessary. You've got connections, right? You could. I held up a hand, cutting him off. Why me? I asked. I haven't been in the business world for a long time, as you can probably tell. He hesitated, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Look, I know it's a big ask, but we're in a real jam here. You've always been good with stuff like this. Could you help us out? Just, give us a leg up. We'd pay you back. I could sense the desperation in his voice, but more than that, I saw the opportunity. This wasn't about business anymore. This was about taking back what had been stolen from me all those years ago. I'll think about it, I said calmly, setting my cup down and standing up. But no promises. I'll have my people reach out. Yeah, sure. Yeah, of course, he muttered quickly, eager to close the deal. He was too desperate to pick up on the real significance of my words. Just let me know, please. I turned to leave, but then I paused at the door and glanced back. Oh, and one more thing, I added, the corner of my mouth twitching. Don't forget, I'm not the same person I was before. I left him standing there, staring at my back as I walked out into the rainy street. I had given him a taste of what was to come, but he wouldn't realize the gravity of that moment until it was too late. I kept my word. I didn't immediately dive into the business, no. I played the waiting game, calculated, deliberate. It's what I had learned over the years. Patience is the key to real power. When I finally took a step forward, it was quiet, unseen. I didn't announce myself to the world. I didn't make grand speeches or present myself as a savior. I simply entered through the back door. A front company, clean, professional, invisible. An investment firm that looked entirely legitimate, with no trace of my name anywhere. I kept my identity hidden, carefully crafted a persona that wouldn't stand out. I remember the first time I walked into the office. It was a small but bustling space, filled with employees who were working their lives away for something they had no real stake in. My brother was in his office, buried under the weight of his problems, but I could feel the tension in the air. He was overwhelmed, desperate for a way out, and I was his lifeline. He just didn't know it yet. It didn't take long before I was brought into the fold. My brother, in all his desperation, welcomed me with open arms, thrilled that someone with money had come to help. He didn't ask questions, didn't dig into my past. He was too caught up in trying to stay afloat to be cautious. He thought he had a partner. What he didn't realize was that he was handing me the reins piece by piece. I spent the next several months quietly observing. I wasn't interested in just making a quick buck. No, this was about something far greater, something that required meticulous attention, control, and most of all, patience. I needed to understand everything, the structure, the relationships, the dirty little secrets buried under layers of bureaucracy. And as I studied, I began to pull strings. I started making subtle moves, quiet suggestions, small shifts in decision-making. At first, no one noticed. I was just another partner, just another voice in the room. But slowly, I began to manipulate the flow of information. I whispered in the right ears, positioned myself as someone who could be trusted, and over time, I made the company dependent on me. I knew how to do it, how to sow the seeds of control without anyone realizing what was happening. It wasn't about forcing anyone's hand. It was about making them think they were making decisions of their own, all while I was pulling the strings from behind the scenes. And it worked. By the time 6 months had passed, I had managed to quietly seize 70% of the company. It wasn't a hostile takeover. It didn't involve any grand gestures or public confrontations. No, it was a slow, methodical process. I'd moved assets around, shifted investments, and with each step, I had tightened my grip. People began to depend on my decisions. They trusted me because they didn't know any better. They thought I was just another businessman helping out. What they didn't know was that I was rewriting the rules of the game. My brother, oblivious to the extent of my influence, still thought he was in control. He was far too distracted with the daily grind of business to see what was happening around him. He believed he had found a lifeline, but I was the one who held the rope, and I wasn't about to let go. I controlled the assets, I controlled the direction of the company, and soon enough, I would control him. I remember one of our last meetings, right before I made my final move. He sat across from me in his office talking about expansion, about how things were going to get better. He was still holding on to the illusion of success, still trying to convince himself that he was in charge. But I could see the cracks in his confidence. I could see how much he relied on me. He had no idea that every move he made was just a part of my plan. "You're a real asset to the company, Ray," he said, smiling weakly. "I don't know where we'd be without you." I smiled back, but it wasn't a smile of gratitude. It was the smile of a man who had already won. "You'll find out soon enough," I said, keeping my voice even, controlled. I had already made the arrangements. The final move was in place. The pieces were set, and there was no going back. Time passed, and everything had fallen into place. The company was now mine in all but name. My brother, who had been so eager to climb higher, had no idea how much of the ground had already been pulled out from under him. He was still basking in the illusion of success, convinced that his newfound partnership was a blessing. He didn't even question why the company was thriving, why everything seemed to be going so well. He had no idea it was all because of the quiet war I'd waged from the inside. Then came the anniversary of my father's death. I had been waiting for this moment, planning it down to the finest detail. It wasn't just a chance to remind my brother of the past. It was the moment when I would finally reveal myself fully, not just as an investor or partner, but as the person who had orchestrated his downfall. He would understand then, fully, that he had never been in control, that I had been there all along, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. I walked into the room with the kind of confidence that only comes from absolute control. It was the same office my brother had always occupied, the one my father had built. There was a certain coldness in the air, familiar yet distant. The walls seemed to close in around me, as if they too were waiting for this moment. The room had always been his domain, but now as I entered, I could feel the shift. It was no longer his space. It was mine, and he would soon realize it. My brother was sitting at his desk, buried in paperwork, his face drawn with the weight of responsibilities he couldn't carry. His eyes flickered up when I walked in, though I could see the surprise cross his features. It took him a moment to register who I was. He blinked twice, then his face flushed, and he quickly straightened up in his chair. "Ray?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "What are you doing here?" I could hear the nervous edge in his voice, the panic just beneath the surface. But I remained calm, as always. I didn't say anything for a moment. I let the silence stretch, giving him time to adjust to what was happening. There was no rush. I'd had 40 years to get to this point. A few more seconds wouldn't matter. Finally, he seemed to gather himself, standing up and walking toward me, his hand extended in what I supposed was an attempt to welcome me, though it came off as more of an automatic gesture. I didn't expect— Of course you didn't, I interrupted, my voice low, measured. You never expected anything, did you? He faltered, his hand still outstretched, unsure of how to proceed. There was no anger in my voice, just a calm, calculated clarity that made him pause. I wasn't here to fight him. He had already lost. I was here to make sure he understood just how thoroughly he had been outplayed. You're probably wondering why I'm here, I said, and you're probably also wondering why things have gone so well for this company. You've felt the upward swing in profits, haven't you? Seen the growth? The momentum? It all seems like it's falling into place, doesn't it? He nodded, but the uncertainty was written all over his face. You're still blind, I said, almost pitying him. The truth is, I've been here the whole time. All those decisions, those big moves you've celebrated, they were mine. The things you thought you'd figured out on your own. Those were just steps in my plan. I paused, watching his reaction carefully. His face was turning pale, but I could see the confusion still lingering in his eyes. He couldn't piece it together. He was too far gone in his own success to recognize the quiet manipulation that had unfolded around him. He still thought he was the one in control, but now the pieces were finally falling into place for him. He was beginning to realize that everything he'd built, everything he'd worked for, had been nothing more than a distraction from the fact that I had already won. You've been losing, I said, and you didn't even know it. Every single step you took was part of the plan I laid out for you. You thought you were climbing the ladder, but in reality, I was just letting you climb so I could take the whole thing down when the time came. His eyes widened. The realization hit him like a freight train. I didn't waste time on theatrics. I didn't need to shout or cause a scene. I simply stood there, letting the weight of my words settle over him. And now, I continued, I'm going to show you exactly what that school taught me. His face went slack as the meaning behind my words sank in. For a moment, he said nothing. Then in a voice barely above a whisper, he asked, "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to take everything," I replied, my voice as cold as ice. "Because you see, it was never yours to begin with. It was done. The final pieces had fallen into place, and everything was exactly as I had planned it." As I sat in the car outside the house that had once belonged to my brother, I allowed myself a brief moment of reflection. It had been 40 years in the making, a slow burn of careful calculation and disciplined restraint. The inheritance, the military school, the years of silence, it had all led to this moment. My brother had no idea when it had all slipped away from him. I'd carefully and quietly acquired more and more shares in his company, nudging him ever so slightly off balance until there was nothing left to hold on to. In the end, I wasn't even necessary to make the company mine. It had already been mine. His role had simply been to play out the final scenes of a script he hadn't written, acting as though he were the one calling the shots. I had given him the illusion of control, letting him feel like he had the upper hand. And then, when I finally showed up, when I finally revealed myself, it was already too late. He lost everything. His company, his position, his wealth, his power. It all crumbled silently, without a single confrontation. There were no violent outbursts, no accusations, no dramatic arguments. There was only me, quietly and steadily taking what had been rightfully mine. The house, my brother's house, was a symbol. It was where I was supposed to be shut out, forgotten. It had once been the place where they had decided to cast me aside. Now it was the final casualty in the war I had waged against them. It was the ultimate prize, the home that had been built with my family's fortune, the house that was supposed to be the pinnacle of my brother's success. But not anymore. I stepped out of the car slowly, deliberately. The air was still, the kind of quiet that hangs over the calm after a storm. The house loomed before me, a silent testament to everything I had taken from them. There was no triumph in my heart, no sense of victory. It was simply the satisfaction of having done what I had set out to do. I walked to the front door, my movements measured and precise, as always. No hasty steps, no anger, no joy, Just the cold, clean efficiency of a man who had planned for decades to get exactly what he was owed. I stood at the door for a moment, staring at it, taking in the familiar details. I knew every inch of this place, had known it when it was just a house, before it had become a fortress for my brother's illusion of success. I didn't knock. I didn't need to. The house was mine now, just as the company was. The people inside, the ones who remained, would soon realize they, too, had been playing a game that was already lost. The door opened, and my brother stood there, looking at me with a mix of disbelief and resignation. His face was pale, his eyes wide, as though he couldn't comprehend how everything had come crashing down so quickly. I didn't say anything at first. I didn't need to. There was no point in gloating. He already knew. When I finally spoke, it was simple, calm, measured. "I've bought everything," I said, my voice flat. "The company, the house, your entire world." His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. He was lost for words, unable to process the depth of his loss. He had thought the world worked in the way he had always believed it did, that success came from hard work, from making deals, from climbing higher. He had never understood the power of patience, of control. He had never understood that the real power wasn't in the flashy moves and the quick gains. It was in the quiet moments, the invisible ones where you knew the outcome before the game even started. "And now," I said, looking him in the eyes, "you'll see what it feels like to be on the other side of the door." His shoulders slumped, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something. Regret, maybe, or just the overwhelming realization that he was completely out of his depth. I turned away and walked back to the car. There was nothing left to say. There was nothing left to do. The final act had already been carried out, and the curtain had fallen. As I drove away, I didn't look back. There was no need. The house, the company, the life he had built, it was all gone. I wasn't evil. I wasn't a villain. I was simply a man who had been abandoned, left to figure out how to survive in a world that didn't want me. And in the end, I had done exactly that. I had built a life for myself, step by quiet step, taking what I had earned, never asking for anything. And when the time came, I took what was mine, what they had kept from me, not with rage, not with violence, but with discipline, intelligence, and patience. And in the end, that was enough.